A field, empty for miles, grass bending flat under a wind that never stops. And then rising out of nowhere, white marble. A spire, a chapel with no church around it, no road leading to it, standing utterly alone under a bruised evening sky. Someone built this in secret. Someone spent a lifetime hiding it here. Tonight that secret runs out of time. Headlights sweep the field, then more. Trucks. Armed men fanning out around stone that has kept its silence for 40 years. A crowbar bites into rock. Metal screams. And somewhere deep inside the spire, something ancient wakes up, a groan of old iron, low and terrible, rolling out into the dark like a warning. No one built this world to ignore. A bell, not imagined, not distant, ringing. And far past the tree line, faint at first, then closer hoofbeats. Someone is coming. The only question left is who gets here first. The rain came down sideways that night, not soft, not gentle, mean. Rose Hale stood ankle-deep in mud behind the barn, one hand pressed flat against the heaving side of a mare named Delphine, the other arm buried to the elbow in a place no manual ever prepared her for. Lightning cracked somewhere over the ridge. The horse screamed. Roz didn't. Easy, she said. Low. Steady. The kind of voice you use when your own heart is a fist banging against your ribs and you can't let it show. Easy, girl. Almost there. Because the foal was turned wrong. Because the vet was 40 minutes out on roads that were half river by now. Because there was no one else. Just Roz. Just her hands. Just 22 years of doing things nobody else wanted to do. She found the leg, rotated it, felt something shift. There she whispered. There you are. 10 minutes later, a wet, trembling foal collapsed onto the straw, and Delphine turned her head and began to lick it clean like the storm outside wasn't still trying to tear the roof off. Roz sat back on her heels, mud to her shoulders, rain in her hair. And for 1 second, one small stolen second, she let herself smile. Because this was the part nobody warned you about. Not the grief. Grief at least people had words for. Casseroles for. Sympathy cards with soft watercolor birds on the front. Nobody sent a card for this. For the 3 years after, when the funeral flowers had long since dried up and been thrown away, and what was left was just a woman and a barn and a list of things that used to be someone else's job. Her husband Daniel had been the one who knew horses, knew engines, knew which fence post would hold and which one was lying to you. Roz had learned by watching and then by necessity, and then somewhere in that second year, she couldn't have said exactly when, by simply becoming the kind of person who no longer needed to watch anyone do anything first. Tonight had been proof of that, if proof was even needed anymore. Then the light in the kitchen window flickered. Once, twice, and went out. Of course, she muttered. Of course it did. She stood there a moment longer in the mud and the last of the rain, looking at the dark square where the kitchen light used to be, and let herself feel it. The tiredness, the particular exhaustion of being the only adult on 300 acres, the only name on the loan, the only hands the animals trusted at 2 in the morning. Then she wiped her face with a sleeve that only made it dirtier and went inside to find the breaker box because feeling it and fixing it were 2 different chores, and only one of them paid the bank. She found the box by memory in the dark fingers, finding the trip switch without needing a light to guide her, and stood there a moment after flipping it back, listening to the refrigerator hum back to life somewhere down the hall like a small, stubborn heartbeat. Small victories, she thought. That's what the last 3 years had become. A whole life measured out in small victories nobody else would ever notice or care about. A foal born safe, a breaker reset, a bill paid 1 week before the due date instead of 2 weeks after. She used to want more than that, used to imagine back when Daniel was still alive, and the future still felt like something that belonged to her, a life with room in it for things beyond survival. Now survival was the whole of most days, and she had made a fragile kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with weather you cannot change. Morning came gray and apologetic, like the sky knew it owed her something. Roz sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago, staring at a stack of envelopes she already knew the contents of. Bank, bank, feed supplier, bank again. Wren came down the stairs 2 at a time, 16 years old, and dressed for chores before the sun had finished deciding whether it wanted to show up. Scout trailed behind, her golden fur still sleep musk tail, already going because Scout's tail was always going. You were out there all night, Wren said. Not a question, she had heard the mare. Delphine had her foal. And she's fine. Foal's fine. Roz didn't look up from the envelopes. Everybody's fine except this kitchen table. Wren poured her own coffee. Didn't sit. Just leaned against the counter and watched her mother the way she'd been watching her for 3 years now, ever since the funeral. Ever since the word widow got stitched onto her mother's name, like a name tag nobody asked for. How bad, Wren asked. Bad enough that if the Wilkinsons don't pay for that seed order by Friday, I'm not sure we make next month's note. Roz finally looked up. Tried a smile. It didn't quite land. But that's a problem for Friday me. Today me has stalls to muck. Wren didn't move from the counter. Didn't pretend to believe the smile either. You said that same thing last month. Because it was true last month too. Mom. Wren. Roz set the envelopes down, squared them into a neat stack, like order there might mean order somewhere else. We're fine. We are always somehow fine. That's the family talent, apparently. Being fine on no money. It wasn't entirely a joke. 3 years since Daniel died and the farm had gone from struggling to bleeding out slow, one small emergency at a time. A transmission here, a vet bill there, feed prices that climbed every season like they had somewhere urgent to be. Roz had sold 2 horses last spring just to make the property tax, and she still dreamed about them. Sometimes wondered whose barn they'd ended up in, whether whoever had them knew Delphine liked her ears scratched a very specific way. She didn't say any of that to Wren. Some weights you carried yourself on purpose because your daughter had already lost a father and didn't need to watch her mother drown too. That was when the truck pulled up the drive. Not the mail truck. A different one. County plates. The man who climbed out wore a rain jacket that had never once seen actual rain, and he held an envelope like it might bite him. Mrs. Hale, he said, checking a clipboard he didn't need to check. Rosalind Hale. Depends who's asking. Legal courier. Got something here, needs a signature. He held out the envelope. Cream-colored. Heavy stock. The kind of paper that costs money just to hold. From an estate attorney's office. Out of state. Roz signed, watched the truck pull away, turned the envelope over in her hands twice before she opened it because envelopes like that never brought good news to women like her. Not in her experience. Wren leaned over her shoulder. Well, who died? Somebody named Roz started, then stopped. Read it again. Elias Marsh. The name meant nothing. Should have meant nothing. Except something in her chest tightened anyway. Some old animal instinct that knew a name before the mind caught up. Never heard of him, Wren said. Neither have I. But the letter said otherwise. The letter, 3 pages typed, signed by an attorney out of a county Roz couldn't have placed on a map, said Elias Marsh was her mother's brother. Her uncle. A man who had lived and apparently died without a single member of the family Roz had ever known so much as speaking his name. Which meant her mother had a brother. Which meant her mother had lied. Or hidden. Or both. Because Vivian Marsh Hale had never once, not in 40 years, mentioned having a sibling. Rose read the last paragraph 3 times before the words sat still long enough to make sense. Mr. Marsh has left you the entirety of his estate, including 340 acres of land in the county records identified as Marsh Ridge, along with all structures and contents thereupon. You are asked to appear at the property no later than 14 days from receipt of this notice, as certain provisions of the will require your physical presence to be executed. Mom, Wren's voice had gone very quiet. Mom, that's land. Is that a lot of land? It's land we don't need and can't afford to get to, Roz said. But her hands weren't steady, and she noticed, and she hated that she noticed. They left 2 days later. Old truck packed tight, Scout riding shotgun, with his head out the window, the whole first hour, like he could smell the destination before they got there. Wren spent the drive with the letter in her lap, reading it over and over like a puzzle she was determined to solve before they even arrived. Roz spent it somewhere else entirely, because driving gave her hands something to do and left her mind free to wander, and her mind kept wandering back to her mother, to Vivian Marsh Hale, who had raised her alone after Roz's father left before Roz was old enough to remember his face, who had worked 2 jobs and still shown up to every school recital with her hair done, like it mattered who had told her daughter 1,000 small stories about a childhood in another county, and never once, not one single time, mentioned a brother. Why? The question kept circling, landing nowhere. Vivian hadn't been a woman who hid things easily. She'd been the opposite, if anything blunt, to the point of embarrassing, the kind of mother who told the mailman exactly what she thought of his parking and told Roz exactly what she thought of every boyfriend before Daniel. A woman like that didn't erase a whole brother by accident, which meant it wasn't an accident, which meant something happened. Something big enough that Vivian decided the safest thing to do with it was bury it so deep her own daughter never found the shovel. 2 hours in, Wren broke the silence without looking up from the letter. Do you think Grandma would be mad that we're going? Roz considered it a long moment. I think she said, finally, your grandmother spent 40 years making sure I never had to ask that question, and now I'm asking it anyway. So, maybe. Or maybe she's the one who left the door unlocked for us to find it. I honestly don't know, baby. There's a photograph, Wren said, somewhere past the second county line. She held up a small black and white print that had been folded into the envelope one Roz hadn't looked at closely. It came with the papers. Look. Roz glanced over at a red light. A young woman, maybe 20, standing in front of something half-built stone, pale, the shape of an archway rising out of scaffolding behind her. The woman was smiling, the careful smile of someone who didn't smile for cameras often. That's not. Roz's voice caught. That looks like my mother. Grandma Vivian. Wren turned the photo over. On the back, faded pencil. VM, spring before. No year, no explanation. Before what? Neither of them had an answer. The truck kept moving. The photograph rode the rest of the way, pressed flat against the dashboard, like if they stared at it long enough, it would decide to explain itself. Marsh Ridge announced itself the way abandoned places always do, not with a sign, but with an absence. Fences that had given up. A gate hanging by one hinge swung permanently half open, like it had been waiting for someone, and finally stopped expecting them. The house itself sat back off the road, and even from a distance, Roz could see the porch had folded in on itself, one whole corner sagging toward the earth, like a shoulder giving out under a weight it had carried too long. Home sweet home, Wren muttered. Roz cut the engine and just looked at it for a long moment. Because inheriting a ruin wasn't a gift. It was a chore with paperwork attached. And she had enough chores. Except when she stepped down out of the truck, boots sinking half an inch into wet grass, something in the air felt different than she expected. Quieter than abandonment usually felt. Like the land was holding its breath. Scout was already gone, a golden blur, streaking across the field toward the tree line, nose down, tail up, chasing something only he could smell. Scout, Wren shouted, taking off after him without a second thought, because that dog had never once come back on the first call in his life. Scout, wait. Roz followed at a walk, arms crossed against a wind that didn't need to be that cold in early autumn. She was still 40 yards from the house when Wren's voice cut across the field, sharp enough to stop her mid-step. Mom, you need to see this. Something in the tone, not fear, not quite, something closer to disbelief. Roz crossed the field at something faster than a walk. She rounded the tree line and stopped. Just stopped. Feet planted, breath gone. Because there in the middle of an empty field, no house near it, no road leading to it, no fence around it, nothing but grass and wind and the far tree line, stood a chapel. Not a shed, not a shrine, a chapel. White marble gone silver gray with weather, easily 4 meters tall. Its narrow spire reaching up into a sky that seemed to bend around it like the sky itself hadn't expected to find it there either. Stained glass windows, most of them cracked, a few still holding jagged color. Deep blue, dark red, caught the afternoon light and threw broken jewels of it onto the grass. Oak double doors carved with vines, and something that might have been wheat stood closed under an archway thick with moss. It stood entirely alone. No walls around it, no path leading to it. Just grass growing wild right up to its marble base, as though the field had grown around a secret and never told anyone what it was hiding. What Wren said slowly is that. Roz didn't answer. Couldn't for a second. Because in 22 years of walking fields not so different from this one, she had never seen anything like it. A chapel with no church around it. A chapel with nothing around it at all. Scout sat at its base, tail thumping the grass, looking immensely pleased with himself. There's no town out here, Wren said, already moving toward it. Drawn the way people are always drawn toward things too strange to leave alone. There's no anything out here. Why would someone build a church in the middle of an empty field? I don't know. Roz's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Do you think is it a grave? Like a mausoleum, I said. I don't know, Wren. But she was walking now, too, because not knowing had never once stopped Roz Hale from finding out. Up close, the scale of it kept doing something strange to her sense of the place. Every few steps, it seemed to grow the way things do when they don't belong where they are, when your eyes keep expecting them to shrink back down to something that makes sense, and they simply refuse. By the time she stood at its base, craning her neck to take in the spire against the moving clouds, she felt the particular vertigo of standing next to something built by hands that had clearly meant it to outlast them. It's beautiful, Wren said, and there was something almost reverent in how quietly she said it. Mom, it's actually beautiful. It was. That was the strangest part. Not grand in the cold way of courthouses or banks buildings meant to remind you of your smallness. This felt made with a different kind of intention entirely. The vines carved into the doors weren't decoration for decoration's sake. They twisted and looped in a pattern that repeated again and again, like someone had carved the same shape over and over until it became a kind of prayer. Somebody loved whoever this was for, Roz said before she'd quite decided to say it out loud. Wren looked at her. You think it's for Grandma? I think Roz said slowly that a man doesn't spend 11 years. That's what the note said. Remember 11 years building something like this for just anybody. Scout, having thoroughly investigated the base of the chapel and found it acceptable, flopped down in the grass with a contented groan tail still going even at rest, as if he alone among the three of them had already decided this place was safe. Roz reached out and laid her palm flat against the marble. Cool. Smoother than she expected. Despite the weather, it had clearly survived. Under her hand, faint but real, she could feel the ridges of some pattern worn nearly flat by decades of rain. The same vine motif from the doors repeating even here on a wall. No one but the builder himself would ever have thought to touch. Up close, the chapel was even stranger. The stonework was fine too. Fine for a homesteader's hand, too careful for something thrown together in a hurry. Whoever built it had built it to last and had built it to be beautiful, and had built it for reasons Roz could not begin to guess, somewhere no one would ever be expected to see it. She walked its perimeter slowly, one hand trailing the stone, counting the carved panels without meaning to. The way you count things when your mind needs somewhere small and manageable to land. 12 panels. She noticed the number and set it aside without understanding yet why it would come to matter. Filed it the way you file the odd details of a dream you know you'll want to remember later, even if you can't say why. The oak doors were locked. A heavy iron ring cold under her palm refused to turn. There's writing, Wren said, crouched near the base fingers, tracing letters cut into the marble threshold. Worn nearly smooth by decades of rain, but still legible if you knew to look. It says, I think it says, what is buried does not stay lost if the right hands come looking. Roz crouched beside her daughter. Read it herself. Felt the words settle somewhere behind her ribs uninvited. That's not comforting, Wren said. That's the opposite of comforting. No, Roz agreed, it really isn't. The house, when they finally reached it, was worse up close than it had looked from the road. Roof half collapsed over what had probably been a bedroom. Floorboards soft with rot in places, solid as iron in others. No way to tell which was which except by weight and prayer. Dust thick enough to write your name in. And under all of it, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like waiting. Careful, Roz said, testing each board before she trusted it. Stay behind me. Wren predictably did not stay behind her. She was already in the back bedroom, running her palm along the wall the way she used to run her hand along fence posts, as a little girl, counting them, needing to touch each one. Mom. There's a loose board. Roz got there in time to watch her daughter pry up a floorboard with the strength of someone who'd spent a summer stacking hay bales. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff with age, sat a leather journal. Roz's hands weren't quite steady when she took it. She sat down right there on the dusty floor, Wren dropping beside her, and opened the cover to handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow already trusted. If you are reading this, then Roz has come, which means I am gone and she is stronger than she knows, because Vivian's children always were. He knew your name, Wren whispered, before you even got here. He knew. Roz kept reading, because there was no version of this where she could stop. Vivian never told her family about me. She had her reasons, and they were good ones, and I will not undo 40 years of her silence in a few pages here. But I will tell you this much. I built the chapel for her, every stone of it. It took me 11 years working alone because I could not undo what happened to us, but I could build something that would outlast it. She came to see it once, only once, before Roz was born. She stood right where you are, likely standing now, and she told me, Elias, it's beautiful, and it's going to break your heart to keep it hidden. She was right as she usually was. Wren's fingers had gone still against the page. So the photo, the one in the letter, that's Grandma Vivian, in front of the chapel, while it was still being built. Before I was born, Roz said quietly. That's what the note on the back meant. Before me. She turned the page. More entries. Years of them, some only a few lines, some pages long, all circling the same unspoken thing, a family history Roz had never once been told, folded up small enough to fit inside a floorboard. The collection grows. 40 years now, most of it coins and pieces others didn't recognize the value of, sold off cheap by people who never learned to look closely at what they were holding. I have learned. I have kept records. When the time comes, Roz will need more than money. She will need to know who to trust with it. Collection, Wren repeated. What collection? Roz turned another page, then another. Whole years seemed to pass between entries. Sometimes gaps of silence. Elias never explained, and then a sudden flood of pages all written close together like something had shaken loose in him. Vivian's girl turned 6 today. I know because I still get the county paper, still watch the announcements, still count the birthdays I'm not invited to. I told myself once that this was fair, that I was the one who stayed, and staying meant giving something up. I am not certain I believe that anymore. Roz married a good man, Daniel Hale. I looked into him the way I look into everyone because looking into people is the only closeness I allow myself anymore. And I am satisfied. He fixes what's broken instead of complaining about it. Vivian would have liked him. Wren had gone very still beside her. He knew about Dad. He knew about me. This whole time, and we never, Mom, he was right there, and we never even knew to look for him. I know Roz's voice had thinned to almost nothing. I know, baby. She turned the page again, and the entries changed. Tone grew heavier. Ink pressed harder into the paper, like the hand writing them had been in a hurry or afraid or both. Daniel is gone. I read it in the obituaries, 3 lines. No mention of how young he was. No mention of the wife and daughter he left behind trying to hold 300 acres together with 2 pairs of hands where there used to be 4. I wanted to write to her. I wrote the letter 4 times and burned it 4 times because what right did I have after 40 years of silence to walk into her grief like I belonged there? I did the only thing I know how to do instead. I kept building. I kept saving. I told myself that someday when the silence had gone on so long, it could not be undone by a letter. It might still be undone by something else. Something she could hold in her hands. I have never spent it. Not truly. What good is money to a man alone on 300 acres? I built the chapel instead, and beneath it I built something else. Something that will matter more to Roz than she can understand from a letter. She will find it if she is patient, and if she trusts her daughter's eyes as much as her own. Wren looked up. My eyes. Apparently your great-uncle had a plan for you before he ever met you. That's either really sweet, Wren said slowly, or really unsettling. I haven't decided. Roz almost laughed. Almost. Because that was exactly the thing about all of this grief and mystery braided so tight together she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Her mother, gone 11 years now, had kept an entire brother's secret, had watched him build a chapel for her, and never told her own daughter he existed. And now here was Roz sitting on a rotted floor in a house that smelled of dust and rain, holding proof of a whole hidden life she'd never once been allowed to know about. Because if Vivian had wanted her to know, she would have told her. Except she hadn't. Not once. Not on her deathbed, not in the quiet years before it, not ever. Which meant the silence itself had been a choice. A deliberate one. And now Roz was going to have to figure out why using nothing but a dead man's journal and a chapel that shouldn't exist. Mom. Wren's hand landed on her arm, gentle grounding. You okay? I don't know yet, Roz admitted. Ask me again once I understand what I'm looking at. They worked the rest of the daylight combing through what remained of the house, every drawer, every cabinet, every space behind every loose board Wren could find, and she found more than Roz would have guessed a 16-year-old had the patience for. The kitchen gave up a tin box full of receipts, decades old, nothing useful. The front room gave up nothing but dust and a chair with 3 legs. It was the study, if you could call it that, a narrow room with one window and a desk too heavy to have ever been moved out, that finally gave them something worth the search. Mom Wren's voice again, careful this time, like she'd learned already not to shout unless it mattered. Bottom drawer's stuck. There's something behind it. It took both of them and a flathead screwdriver Roz kept in her jacket out of habit to work the drawer free. Behind it, taped to the underside of the desk, where no casual search would ever find it, was a folded square of oilskin. Inside that, a hand-drawn map of the property, ink gone brown with age, and beside it a key. Not a small key. Roz turned it over in her palm and felt its weight settle strangely heavier than a piece of metal that size had any business being. Iron maybe, or iron over something else tarnished nearly black. But along the shaft, faint under decades of grime, a line of symbols had been carved with obvious care. Not letters, not any alphabet Roz recognized. Small shapes repeating the same vine pattern from the chapel doors, worked into the metal itself. That's the same design, Wren said, tracing the carving on the chapel doors from memory, then the key back and forth like she was checking her own eyes. The vines, same pattern exactly, which means this opens the chapel, which means Uncle Elias wanted whoever found this desk to also find the chapel. He built it like a trail, on purpose. Rose unfolded the map carefully, corners threatening to crumble at the creases. The property outline was rough but clear. The ruined house marked with a small square, the tree line sketched in with quick, confident strokes. And there in the empty field where the chapel stood, a single mark, not a cross like the others, scattered lightly across the page, but a circle drawn and redrawn so many times the ink had gone through the paper in places like the hand that made it had needed again and again to be certain of exactly where it belonged. By the time the light started going gold and long across the field, they'd assembled a small pile of things that made no sense on their own, and even less sense together. The heavy iron key, the hand-drawn map marked with small crosses in places that meant nothing yet, and one circle that meant everything. And the photograph still riding along in Wren's back pocket, Vivian's careful smile aimed at a chapel that hadn't finished being built. That key's too heavy, Wren said, turning it over in her palm for the 10th time. Feel it. That's not iron. Or not just iron. Roz took it. Wren was right. There was a weight to it that didn't match its size, a density that made her think uneasily of things buried far more literally than secrets usually were. It's for the chapel doors, Roz said. Has to be. Then why haven't we tried it? Because it's getting dark and I am not walking my 16-year-old daughter into a locked stone building in the middle of an empty field after sunset, mystery inheritance or not. Wren opened her mouth to argue, closed it, because even she apparently had limits on how much strangeness she wanted to walk into after dark. They made camp in the one room of the house with a roof that still held the kitchen. Oddly enough, its old iron stove, somehow still standing despite everything else around it falling apart. Scout curled up against the stove's cold iron belly, like he'd claimed it personally. Wren fell asleep with the journal still open on her chest, one finger marking a page she hadn't finished. Roz didn't sleep. Sat by the window instead, watching moonlight pool silver over the field, over the chapel's pale spire rising up out of the grass, like something that had always been waiting there, and had simply been patient about being found. Why hide it, Mom? She thought, the words arriving unbidden, aimed at a woman 11 years gone. Why keep a whole brother a secret? Why let him build something so beautiful and never let me see it while you were alive? No answer came. Just wind and grass moving, and somewhere far off an owl deciding the night belonged to it. Because that was the thing about grief you carried alone for years. It didn't stay in one shape. It kept changing on you. Tonight it wasn't Daniel she was grieving, not exactly, and it wasn't quite her mother either. It was something stranger. Grief for a life she'd never known she was allowed to have. An uncle. A whole hidden branch of family built in silence, kept in silence, and now handed to her all at once like a debt she hadn't known was owed. Except it wasn't a debt, she thought. It was a gift, wasn't it? A strange one, a heavy one, but a gift. She wasn't sure yet which it was going to turn out to be. Wren stirred in her sleep, murmured something Roz couldn't catch, one hand still resting on the journal's cracked spine like she meant to keep reading the moment she woke, whether or not the sun had come up yet to give her light to do it by. Roz watched her daughter's face in the dark and felt the old fierce thing rise up in her chest, the thing that had nothing to do with money or land or dead relatives, and everything to do with the simple fact that this girl was hers, and she would burn every acre of Marsh Ridge to the ground before she let a stranger in an expensive suit make either of them afraid in their own inheritance. She was still awake when headlights swept across the ceiling. Roz was on her feet before she'd finished deciding to move one hand instinctively, finding Wren's shoulder, shaking her gently but urgently awake. Someone's here. Who, I don't know. Stay close. They stepped out onto the sagging porch together. Scout planted between them and the drive, a low growl building in his chest that Roz had never once heard from him before. The truck that pulled up was clean. Too clean for a road this rutted, too clean for a property this abandoned. Whoever owned it took better care of it than most people took of their homes. The man who climbed out wore a suit, an actual suit tailored the kind that had no business existing 60 miles from the nearest town large enough to sell one. He smiled before he'd even reached the porch steps, a smile that had been practiced in mirrors, polished, smooth, worn like a tool rather than an expression. "Mrs. Hale," he said, like he already knew her, like he'd known her for years. "I hope I'm not intruding at such a late hour. I'm Marcus Vane." "You're intruding," Roz said. "It's nearly midnight. Then I'll be brief." His eyes moved past her, past the porch, out across the dark field and stopped. Stopped and stayed fixed on the pale shape of the chapel, just visible under the moonlight, its spire catching the last of the light like it had been waiting for exactly this moment to be seen by exactly this man. Something in his practiced smile flickered, just for a second, just long enough that Roz caught it. "That's quite a structure you've got out there," Vane said, and his voice had changed, some careful edge sharpening underneath the pleasantness. "Unusual for a property like this. We just found it ourselves." "Did you?" He said it slowly, like he didn't quite believe her, like the chapel meant something to him that it hadn't yet meant to her. "Mrs. Hale, I represent an organization that specializes in land acquisition, difficult properties, complicated inheritances, that sort of thing. I understand your uncle's estate came to you rather suddenly. Unexpected windfalls can be more burden than blessing. We haven't even had a chance to see what's here, which is exactly why I'm here to help." He reached into his jacket, produced a card, held it out with 2 fingers like he was dealing a hand of cards he already knew he'd win. "I'm prepared to offer you $60,000 for the full 340 acres. Cash, fast closing. You wouldn't have to lift another finger out here. $60,000, enough to save the farm outright, enough to pay off the note, replace the roof, keep the bank off her back for years." The number sat there in the dark between them, heavy and tempting and wrong in a way Roz couldn't yet name. Because she'd spent 3 years doing math like this in her head at kitchen tables and truck cabs, lying awake at 2 in the morning, running numbers that never quite added up to enough. $60,000 could fix everything. $60,000 was supposed to fix. And that was exactly what made it feel like a trap instead of a gift. "That's a lot of money," she said carefully, "for land you're calling difficult. I see opportunity where others see problems." His eyes flicked back to the chapel one more time, quick and hungry. "The offer stands for 48 hours. I'd hate for you to lose out on it." Wren's hand found Roz's sleeve, gripping tight, not saying anything, not needing to, because both of them had noticed the same thing in the same instant, that a man offering $60,000 for worthless land had not once in this entire conversation looked at the ruined house, only at the chapel. "I'll think about it," Roz said. "Please do." Vane's smile came back smooth as glass, betraying nothing. "Some opportunities don't come twice, Mrs. Hale." He got back in his truck, drove away, slow headlights sweeping once more across the field, across the chapel's pale marble spire, before the dark swallowed the road behind him. Roz stood on the porch a long time after the sound of his engine had faded. Wren silent beside her, Scout's growl only now settling into something closer to a watchful hum. "He knew about it," Wren finally said. Before he even got here. The way he looked at it, Mom, he knew. I know. So what do we do? Roz looked out across the dark field to the shape of a chapel her mother had stood in front of 40 years ago and never once mentioned again, to a key too heavy for its size, sitting cold in her jacket pocket, to a locked door with words carved into its threshold about things that did not stay lost. She thought about the journal entry she hadn't shown Wren yet, the one near the back, the one she'd read twice already, because the first time hadn't felt real. If anyone comes before Roz is ready, if anyone comes asking after what's mine before she's had the chance to understand it, the chapel will tell her everything she needs. She only has to listen for it. She hadn't understood what that meant. Not yet. But watching Vane's taillights shrink to nothing down the dark road, she had a feeling she was about to. We find out what's inside it, she said. Before he does. Tonight, tomorrow. First light. Roz put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, steadying them both. Whatever your great-uncle hid in there, he hid it for us. Not for a man in a suit who drives 60 miles after midnight to make an offer nobody sane would make on empty land. Wren nodded slowly, some of the fear in her face settling into something harder, more determined, a look Roz recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror plenty of times these last 3 years. He's going to come back. I know, with more than an offer. I know that too. Scout pressed himself against Wren's legs, a low rumble still working in his chest. Eyes fixed on the dark road long after the truck's engine had faded into silence. Somewhere out past the tree line the wind shifted, and for just a moment, faint enough that Roz almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, she thought she heard something that sounded almost like a bell, one low distant note carried and gone before she could be certain it had been real at all. She stood very still, listening for it to come again. It didn't. But she didn't stop watching the dark shape of the chapel across the field, not for a long while, not until Wren finally tugged her back toward the house, and the last of the night's cold made the decision for both of them. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow they would find out what Elias Marsh had built beneath his 11 years of grief and silence. And whatever it was, she intended to understand it before Marcus Vane ever got the chance to lay a hand on it. Morning came without ceremony, gray light sliding in through a broken window Roz hadn't bothered fixing because there hadn't been time, because there was never time, because time was the one thing Marcus Vane had made very clear he wasn't going to give them. 48 hours, that was the offer. That was the countdown ticking somewhere behind every thought Roz had had since his taillights vanished down the dark road. She hadn't slept, not really. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, she'd given up pretending and gone to sit at the kitchen table with the journal reading Elias's entries by flashlight, until the words started blurring together, until she'd had to close her eyes and just breathe for a while, because grief and fear together made for a heavier weight than either one carried alone. He built something for us, she kept thinking, which means somewhere in all of this there's a reason. There has to be a reason, because nobody spends 11 years on stone and mortar without a reason. She was already at the chapel by the time Wren stumbled out of the house, coffee in hand, Scout at her heels with the particular energy of a dog who'd slept better than either of the humans he lived with. Roz stood at the base of the marble steps, the heavy iron key already in her palm, turning it over and over, like the motion itself might reveal what she was supposed to do with it. You didn't wait for me, Wren said around a yawn. I've been standing here for 20 minutes not doing anything. That counts as waiting. Barely. Wren climbed the steps, ran her fingers along the carved oak doors over vines that repeated and repeated like a held breath. So, we just put it in the lock. Turn it. That's it. That's the theory. Except the theory fell apart the second Roz actually looked at the lock itself. Because it wasn't one lock. It had never been one lock. What she'd taken in the dim moonlight 2 nights ago for a single keyhole was, in the honest light of morning, 4 separate mechanisms set into the stone at the corners of the door in a pattern she hadn't noticed until now. Small brass discs, each ringed with numbers worn nearly smooth. Each one clearly needing something and the iron key alone could not provide. Well, Wren said, that is new, that's a problem. Which we solve how Roz crouched studying the discs closer. 4 locks, 4 numbers, each disc showing digits from 0 to 9, waiting to be turned into some sequence that meant something to somebody. Which meant this wasn't a lock built to keep out strangers with crowbars. This was a lock built to keep out everybody except the one person who already knew the answer. Which means Elias didn't build this to be broken into, she thought. He built it to be remembered into. Combination locks, she said aloud. Elias wanted whoever found this to already know the numbers. Not guess them. Know them. Wren's eyes went wide. Family dates. Family dates. They stood there a long moment, the two of them, the weight of it settling. Because if this was true, if Elias Marsh had built a vault that only opened to someone carrying the private calendar of Vivian Marsh Hale's life, then he hadn't been building a puzzle for strangers. He'd been building a door that only his sister's daughter could ever walk through. On purpose. After all those years of silence, after all that distance, he'd made absolutely certain that whoever eventually stood here would have to know the family, truly know it in her bones, not from a letter, in order to get inside. Mom, Wren's voice had gone soft. That's kind of beautiful, actually, in a really elaborate, slightly insane way. Your uncle Elias Roz said does not appear to have done anything the simple way. The first disc took 3 tries. Roz said it to her mother's birthday, March the 15th a year, that felt strange to turn into a number like reducing a whole person down to 6 digits was somehow disrespectful, even as it was necessary. The little brass ring clicked into place with a sound that felt bigger than it should have. A small, definite thunk that traveled up through the stone. One Wren breathed. Don't count out loud. You'll jinx it. That's not how combination locks work, Mom. Everything's how combination locks work today. Don't jinx it. The second disc Roz used her own birthday. August the 23rd. Another click deeper this time, like something further inside the door had shifted in response. 2 Wren said anyway, softer this time, half a smile fighting through the nerves. The third, and here Roz hesitated, hand hovering over the dial because the third date wasn't hers to give freely. Daniel's death had a date. She knew it the way you know your own name, the way grief carves numbers into you whether you want them or not. But using it here on a door built by a man who'd never met her husband for a purpose, she still didn't fully understand, felt like handing a stranger something too tender to hand anyone. Mom, give me a second. We don't really have a second. Vane's countdown. I know what Vane's countdown is. Wren, give me the second anyway. Except the journal had said it plainly enough, hadn't it? Daniel is gone. I read it in the obituaries. Elias had known, had grieved it from a distance alone the way he grieved everything, which meant this date wasn't a stranger's to hold. It was already his. He'd carried it in silence for 3 years right alongside her. Roz set the third disc to the day she'd buried her husband. The click that followed was quieter than the others, almost gentle. 3 Wren whispered and reached for her mother's hand without being asked, held it a moment, let go. The fourth disc sat there waiting, and Roz found herself entirely out of guesses. Because what date was left? Whose calendar hadn't she already spent? She thought of Wren's birthday, tried it, felt nothing shift. Thought of her wedding day, tried that too, and the disc simply spun free, refusing to catch. It's not working. Try Grandma's, Wren said. The day I tried her birthday already. First disc, not her birthday. Wren's voice had gone very careful, very quiet. The other one. Roz understood what her daughter meant before she finished the sentence, and hated that she understood, because it meant setting the final dial to the worst day of her own life before Daniel, the day 11 years ago. Now that she had stood at another grave entirely and promised herself she would never again feel that particular kind of empty. Her hands were not steady when she turned the last disc to her mother's death date. The fourth click came like something exhaling, and then low and grinding stones shifting against stone somewhere deep in the chapel's foundation, the great oak doors swung inward on hinges that hadn't moved in years, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled of old incense and older secrets. Wren grabbed her mother's arm. Mom, I know. We're really doing this. We're really doing this. They stepped inside together. The interior was smaller than the outside promised, and stranger for it, a single narrow room, the ceiling rising up into the dark of the spire above stained glass, throwing broken color across the stone floor, swept clean of dust in a way nothing else on the property had been. Someone had come here regularly. Someone had cared for this room long after everything around it had been left to rot. At the far end, where an altar should have stood, sat instead a low stone table, and set into its surface, Flush with the marble, a single square panel marked with the same vine carving that ran through everything Elias had touched. Rose crossed to it, pressed her palm flat against the stone the way she had against the outer wall 2 nights before. Nothing happened, and for a long moment she thought that was the end of it, that whatever answer this room held required some further combinations she hadn't yet found. Then Wren crouched at the base of the altar, said, "There's a seam here." "Mom, look, it's a door. The whole table's a door." It took both of them, hands braced, shoulders straining, before the stone panel finally gave, sliding aside with a grinding reluctance to reveal a set of narrow steps leading down into dark. "Okay," Wren said, staring into the black. "Okay, that is either the coolest thing I have ever seen or the beginning of a horror movie, and I genuinely cannot tell which yet." "Stay close," wasn't planning on doing anything else. Roz went first, one hand trailing the cold stone wall phone flashlight, cutting a thin white path down steps worn smooth by feet that hadn't walked them in years, but had clearly walked them often once. The air changed as they descended, cooler, drier, carrying a faint mineral smell like the inside of a cave mixed with something else underneath it. Something almost like beeswax, like candles burned here once long ago by a man who came down alone to sit with whatever he'd hidden and remember why he'd hidden it. The passage opened after a dozen steps into a chamber that made Roz stop breathing for a full second. Because the walls were lined with shelving, floor to ceiling, and every shelf held small wooden boxes, each one labeled in Elias's careful hand dates, mostly, and sometimes a single word. Denver, Colorado Springs, the auction in Cheyenne, and beyond them at the chamber's center, a chest large enough to require two people simply to lift its lid. "Mom." Wren's flashlight had found something else, a leather-bound ledger sitting on a small writing desk tucked into the corner, its cover worn soft with handling. "There's more than money down here." Roz let her light travel slowly around the room, taking it in the careful order of it boxes arranged not by size or value, but by some system only. Elias would have understood cobwebs in the corners, but none on the shelves themselves, meaning someone had dusted this room, tended it, visited it regularly enough to keep it from surrendering entirely to time. A man building a shrine, she thought, not to money, to patience. The chest, when they finally worked the lid open, held coins. Rows of them wrapped in individual cloth, some in cases that had clearly been sealed for decades, each one catching the flashlight's beam and throwing it back gold and silver against the dark stone walls. Roz had never in her life seen so much wealth in one place, and some distant, exhausted part of her brain did the math without being asked. Thought of the note at the bank, thought of the roof and the transmission and the 2 horses she'd sold last spring and still dreamed about some nights. Thought of every small emergency that had eaten away at 3 years of trying to hold 300 acres together with 2 hands where there used to be 4. One box, she thought, staring at rows of coins that seemed to go on and on under the flashlight's beam. This is one box, and it could cover a decade of bad years, which means the $60,000 he offered wasn't generous. It was an insult. He knew exactly what was down here, and he offered us pocket change to walk away from it. The thought made something in her chest go hard and cold, replacing some of the fear that had lived there for 2 days with something closer to anger. Because Marcus Vane hadn't come here to negotiate. He'd come here to steal, dressed up in a good suit and a practiced smile, counting on a struggling widow, being too desperate and too tired to notice the difference. She wasn't too tired, not anymore. But it was the ledger that held Wren's full attention, both hands wrapped around it like it might try to leave. "Mom, listen to this," she read aloud, voice unsteady. "A collection is only as valuable as the hands that know how to carry it forward without losing it to those who would take it by force or by fraud. I have spent 15 years building a second inheritance alongside the first, not gold, but trust. 12 names, 12 women across this territory, and beyond each one, a widow or a woman alone. Each one honest, where honesty is rare in this trade. Each one already proven to protect what does not belong to her." Roz took the ledger from her daughter's hands, read the names herself. 12 of them, each with an address, a trade, a jeweler in one county, an auctioneer in another, a woman who ran a small bank 2 territories over. Beside each name, notes in Elias's careful script, small histories of how he'd come to trust each one, small kindnesses, small proofs. She read one entry twice before it fully landed. "Margaret Foss, Deer Creek. Widowed young like Vivian. took over her husband's shop rather than sell it to men who assumed a woman couldn't run a business alone. I trust her because she has already survived what Roz may someday have to survive, and survived it with her name intact. Another, Adelaide Cross, formerly of the Territorial Marshal Service, now private security. 15 years in my confidence, recommended by 3 separate sources, none of whom knew the others had recommended her. That kind of consistency is not an accident. Roz's breath caught on the name, filed it away without quite knowing why it mattered, yet only that it did. He built a whole network, she said slowly. Women he trusted enough to help move something this size without it being stolen out from under whoever inherited it. Because he knew, Wren said, even back then, he knew someone like Vane would come looking eventually. Which was, Roz realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the seller's cold exactly right. Because a man didn't spend 15 years quietly building a network of trustworthy women to help liquidate a fortune unless he expected someday for someone untrustworthy to try and take it first. She flipped further into the ledger and near the back found an entry dated only months before Elias's death, ink shakier than the rest, a hand that had clearly begun to fail, even as the mind behind it hadn't. If Roz is reading this, then I am gone, and she has found the vault, which means she is stronger and more patient than I dared hope in my letters. Tell her this. The coins are not the inheritance. The names are. 12 women who will not cheat her, 12 women who understand what it costs to be alone and unprotected in a world built to take advantage of exactly that. If she trusts them, she will never again have to stand where I stood alone with a fortune and no one who would not try to take it from her. Wren was crying before Roz finished reading it aloud, and Roz found her own eyes stinging too, because somewhere in all of this, the strange chapel, the buried gold, the uncle she'd never met, was a man who had spent the last years of his life trying in the only language he knew to make absolutely certain his niece would never be as alone as he had been. He loved us, Wren said. He never met us, and he loved us anyway. He did. Roz closed the ledger gently. He really did. They spent a while longer in that chamber, not because there was anything left to decide, but because neither of them was quite ready to leave it yet. Wren opened the small wooden boxes one at a time, careful as a surgeon, and read the labels aloud like a kind of prayer. 1933, found in Denver from a widow who didn't know what she was selling. 1916, traded fair at a price the seller was glad of. Every entry the same quiet insistence that Elias had built this fortune, honestly, patiently, never once taking advantage of anyone poorer or less informed than himself, even when the opportunity to do so must have come along more than once in 40 years. He could have been rich 100 times faster, Wren said, turning a small silver coin over in her palm, if he'd just cheated people the way Vane's probably planning to cheat us. That was never who he was, Roz said. You can tell that from every single page of this. He built something slow and honest instead of something fast and cruel. That's not nothing, Wren. That's the whole reason we can trust any of this. Somewhere above them, faint but unmistakable Scout began to bark. Not his happy bark, not the one for squirrels or strangers he'd already decided to love. A different bark entirely. Sharp. Urgent. The bark of a dog telling you as clearly as a dog could that something was wrong. They didn't hear the trucks until it was almost too late. The bark grew louder, more frantic, joined a moment later by the crunch of tires on gravel far above, and Roz was already moving toward the stairs when the first flashlight beam swept down into the chamber from above, and a voice she recognized called down into the dark. Mrs. Hale, I do hope you found something worth the trip. Marcus Vane stood at the top of the stairs, no longer wearing the practiced smile from 2 nights ago. Behind him, silhouetted against the chapel's stained glass, 4 men she didn't recognize, and every one of them was armed. You're trespassing, Roz said, climbing the steps slowly, one hand behind her, urging Wren up ahead of her, keeping her own body between her daughter and the men above. I'm renegotiating. Vane's eyes moved past her into the chamber below, and Roz watched something greedy and cold settle over his face as the flashlight beam caught the gleam of the chest. That's a great deal more than $60,000 worth of coins, Mrs. Hale. I underestimated your uncle. I won't make that mistake twice. Get off my property. Your property. He said it almost gently, almost like pity. Do you understand what you're actually holding here? That collection is worth, by conservative estimates, somewhere north of $100 million. And you were prepared to let a bank take your farm over what, 10,020? He shook his head. You should be thanking me. I found this land for you, in a manner of speaking. You found it because you were already watching this property before we ever got the letter, Roz said, and watched the flicker of surprise cross his face, confirm exactly what she'd suspected since the night he'd shown up at midnight, already knowing the chapel existed. How long, Mr. Vane? How long have you had men out here watching an old dying man build something you couldn't understand and couldn't touch? Long enough, Vane said, to know that Elias Marsh was very good at hiding things and very bad at hiding them from people with resources. My employer has been interested in this property for years. He simply lacked a legal heir cooperative enough to make the arrangement clean. Your employer, Roz repeated slowly. This isn't the first time you've done this, is it? Something in Vane's expression shifted just slightly, the particular flicker of a man who enjoyed being asked about his work more than he'd admit. There are a great many overlooked properties in this territory, Mrs. Hale. A great many heirs who inherit more than they understand and less prepared than you to hold on to it. My employer has an eye for opportunity. I merely execute it. How many? Roz kept her voice level, kept pushing, because every word out of his mouth was a word that might matter later, if there was going to be a later. How many families have you done this to, enough that the process has become quite efficient? He said it the way another man might describe streamlining a factory line, no more weight to it than that. Most are considerably more reasonable than you've been, Mrs. Hale. Most understand the wisdom of cooperation rather quickly. And the ones who don't, Vane didn't answer that one. Just smiled thin and cold and let the silence do the answering for him. And if I'm not cooperative, Vane's smile came back, and it was worse this time. Worse for how calm it was. Then we do this the difficult way, Mrs. Hale. And I promise you, the difficult way is considerably less pleasant for everyone involved, especially for her. His eyes went to Wren just for a second, just long enough to make his meaning entirely clear. Roz felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. The particular stillness that comes right before a person decides exactly how far they're willing to go to protect the thing that matters most. Because she had buried a husband, she was not going to bury a daughter too, not for coins, not for $100 million, not for anything a man like Marcus Vane thought he was owed. She thought in that cold, clear instant of every hard thing she had already survived without help. The mare in the storm, the bank letters, the 2 years of learning alone how to be both parents to a girl who deserved better than half a family. None of it had broken her. She did not intend to let a man in a tailored suit be the thing that finally did. Touch her, Roz said, and I will make absolutely certain you never see one coin from that vault. I'll burn the chapel down around it before I let that happen. For just a second, barely a second, something flickered across Vane's face that might have been respect buried under all that practiced calm. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cold patience. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, he said, for everyone's sake. They were marched back to the house at gunpoint, made to sit at the same kitchen table where Roz had once stared down a stack of unpaid bills, while 2 of Vane's men tore through what remained of the rooms, searching for anything else that might be useful, and 2 more stood guard by the door. Rose kept her hands flat on the table, kept her breathing even because panic was a language her body wanted badly to speak right now, and she could not afford to let it. Wren sat rigid beside her, and under the table Roz found her daughter's hand and held it once hard, a single silent message. Still here, still together, still thinking. Because thinking was the only weapon either of them had left in a kitchen full of armed men. Elias built this place to protect us, she thought, turning it over and over, searching for the piece she was missing. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't careless. Every single thing he built had a reason behind it, which means there's a reason we haven't found yet, which means I just have to survive long enough to find it. The ledger, Vane said, holding out his hand. Now. Wren's fingers tightened around it, and for one terrible second, Roz thought her daughter might actually refuse, might do something reckless that would end badly for both of them in a kitchen, this small with this many armed men standing in it. But Wren was faster than fear and cleverer than her 16 years usually got credit for. Under the table, out of the direct line of sight from the men by the door, her fingers found the very last page, Elias's final entry. The one meant only for Roz, and tore it free along the binding's natural seam so cleanly that no one watching would think to count the pages. It disappeared into her jacket pocket before her mother had even finished registering what she'd done. Wren! Roz kept her voice level, kept her eyes from dropping to that pocket even once. Give it to him. Mom, give it to him. Wren handed it over, jaw tight, eyes burning, and Vane flipped through it with the careless speed of a man who understood he was holding something valuable, but had no idea yet how to read it properly. 12 names, he said slowly. Interesting. Your uncle was thorough. He tucked it into his jacket, never once noticing the binding had been quietly disturbed. This will save us considerable time. It was Wren, sharp-eyed even now, who noticed what none of the rest of them had. The two men who'd been searching the house had come back out to the truck, not with more boxes of coins, but with coils of rope and heavy canvas sacks, and something long and dark wrapped in a tarp that had no business being part of any legitimate business deal. She didn't say anything, just found her mother's eyes across the kitchen table and let the fear in her own face say it instead. Because ropes weren't for carrying coins, and sacks that size weren't for carrying coins either. Roz followed her daughter's gaze out the window. Watched one of the men test a coil of rope between his hands, the way you'd test something you expected to use. Soon watched another drag the tarp-wrap bundle toward the barn instead of the truck bed, and felt the full weight of what those supplies actually meant settle into her stomach like a stone. They're not planning to leave witnesses, she thought, and the thought arrived so plainly, so certainly, that she almost couldn't believe it had taken this long to see it clearly. Vane never intended for either of us to walk away from this property once the vault was empty. The $60,000 was never the real offer. We were never going to get to spend it. She understood in one terrible clarifying instant exactly how much danger they were actually in. Not theoretical danger, not the vague unease of armed strangers on her land, but the specific, deliberate, planned-out kind of danger that came with rope and canvas, and men who'd clearly done this sort of work before. They spent the next hour under guard, while Vane's men worked out how to move the chest without the combination that would open the rest of the underground chamber. Because Roz had noticed and said nothing, that the chest they'd found had itself been sitting atop a second larger seam in the stone floor, one that hadn't yet been touched, one that likely required a combination none of Vane's men currently possessed, which meant they still needed her, which meant for now, at least they were still alive. She used the waiting to study the men themselves quietly, without seeming to the way you study weather before deciding whether to trust it. The younger one by the door kept glancing at his own boots more than at his prisoners, as if some part of him had already started regretting the job before it finished. The older ones moved with the flat, unbothered efficiency of men who had done this exact kind of work more than once before and stopped feeling much of anything about it years ago. Neither observation changed their situation, but it steadied her to have something to do with her mind besides fear. Vane returned to the kitchen alone this time, and something in the set of his shoulders told Roz his patience had thinned considerably in the last hour. "Take the girl outside," he said to one of his men. "Her mother and I need to speak privately." "No." Roz was on her feet before the word had finished leaving her mouth. "She stays with me." "That wasn't a request, Mrs. Hale. Neither is this." Roz put herself between the man and her daughter, every ounce of the same steadiness that had gotten a foal turned right in a thunderstorm, now aimed squarely at a man twice her size, holding a gun he clearly knew how to use. "You want cooperation? You'll get considerably less of it if you separate us. I promise you that." Vane studied her for a long moment, something almost like curiosity crossing his face, the particular look of a man recalculating an opponent he'd underestimated. "Fine," he said finally. "She stays. But she doesn't speak unless spoken to, and if either of you tries anything clever, I assure you the consequences will land on whichever of you is standing closest to me. Are we understood?" "Understood," Roz said. Wren, jaw tight, said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. "There's another lock," Vane said, finally returning to the topic that mattered, the air of a man whose patience had run precisely as far as it was going to go. "Beneath the chest. My men can't move it without breaking something valuable in the process, and I would very much prefer not to break anything valuable tonight." He set the ledger down on the table in front of her, open to a blank page in the back. "You're going to write down the next combination for me, Mrs. Hale. I don't know it. I don't believe you. I don't." And that at least was entirely true. Roz had no idea what further sequence of dates might open whatever lay beneath the chest, and she said so with the flat certainty of someone who had nothing left to gain by lying about it. Vane studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he believed her, however reluctantly. "Then we'll find it the old-fashioned way," he said, "starting with that chapel of yours." He turned to one of his men. "Get the tools. If the numbers won't open it, we'll open it ourselves. They walked back to the chapel under a sky gone the deep bruised color of full dark flashlights bobbing across the field. Vane's men flanking them, close enough that running wasn't a real option, even if Roz had been willing to leave without knowing what waited underground. Stall, Roz thought. Every minute you stall is a minute closer to something changing. You don't know what. Doesn't matter. Stall anyway. Inside, back at the base of the stairs, one of Vane's men had already produced a crowbar and set it against the second seam in the stone, the one beneath where the chest had stood testing its edges, with the particular carelessness of someone who had never once in his life cared for anything as much as Elias Marsh had cared for this place. Wait, Roz said again, sharper this time. There has to be another way. There isn't time for another way, Vane said. You had your chance to be helpful, Mrs. Hale. You don't understand what you're threatening to break. Roz kept talking, kept her voice moving because every second of argument was a second the crowbar wasn't yet doing damage. My uncle spent 40 years on this. You think a man that careful didn't plan for exactly this? Someone trying to force their way in? You could trigger something. You could destroy the very thing you came here for. Vane hesitated, just barely weighing greed against caution. Then impatience won the way it always seemed to with him. We'll take that risk, he said. Move. The man with the crowbar drove it into the seam. Metal shrieked against stone. And somewhere above them, deep in the chapel spire, something ancient and mechanical shifted loose from decades of stillness. A low groan of old iron waking up followed a heartbeat later by a single deep, resonant note that rolled out across the dark field like a wave. A bell. Not imagined this time. Not distant. Real and ringing and growing louder with every second that man's crowbar stayed jammed in the stone, as though the chapel itself had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment to finally speak. What is that? Vane said, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his voice had lost every trace of its practiced calm. Roz looked up at the spire, its sound rolling out into the dark countryside in every direction, and felt something that had been sitting heavy and afraid in her chest for 2 straight days shift just slightly towards something else entirely. Because Elias Marsh had told her in his own careful hand that the chapel would speak for her if she couldn't speak for herself. She just hadn't understood until this exact moment that he'd meant it literally. I have absolutely no idea, Roz said, and for the first time in 2 days she almost smiled. Vane's men exchanged glances, uncertain now, in a way none of them had been an hour ago. Hands drifting toward weapons pointed at nothing in particular. Eyes flicking to the doorway, to the dark field beyond it, to the sound still rolling out across the countryside, like it had no intention of stopping. One of them said something low to Vane, something Roz couldn't quite catch, and whatever it was, it didn't sit well. Vane's jaw tightened, and for the first time all night, real uncertainty crossed his face. Get her back to the house, he snapped. Now, if someone heard that. Someone was always going to hear that Roz said and meant it as more than just words. Because standing there listening to sound roll out over 340 acres of land her uncle had spent 40 years quietly protecting, she understood with sudden complete certainty that this bell had never rung by accident, and it had never rung for no one. Elias Marsh had built it to call for help, which meant somewhere out there someone was listening for exactly this sound and had been listening patiently for years. Wren's hand found hers in the dark, gripping tight, and Roz gripped back, and for the first time since Marcus Vane's truck had first pulled up their drive 2 nights ago, she let herself believe just barely just enough to keep standing, that the night might not end the way he intended it to. Above them, the bell rang on. Vane grabbed her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and hauled her toward the doorway. Whoever hears that bell, he said, low and furious, now all pretense gone, had better not be foolish enough to come looking. Because if they do, Mrs. Hale, I promise you won't like what they find when they get here. They'll find exactly what you brought with you, Roz said, refusing to let her voice shake, even as his grip tightened further. Armed men. A kidnapped family. Rope and sacks you clearly didn't pack for carrying coins. I don't think that's the story you want told, Mr. Vane. Something flickered behind his eyes, the first real crack she'd seen in him all night, and for just a moment Roz thought he might actually let go. He didn't. But the bell kept ringing, rolling out over 340 acres of dark countryside, and somewhere beyond the tree line, faint but growing, came a sound that hadn't been there a minute before. Horses. More than one. Moving fast. Wren heard it too, her head snapping toward the sound, eyes wide. Mom, I hear it. Vane heard it as well, and for the first time all night, the calm, practiced businessman was entirely gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a cornered man deciding in real time exactly how far he was willing to go to keep what he'd already convinced himself belonged to him. Move her, he snapped to his men. Now, we're not finished here. The bell rang on, and the hoofbeats grew louder, and Roz Hale stood in the doorway of a chapel her uncle had built with his own hands to protect a family he'd never once been allowed to meet, and understood with a certainty that steadied her more than any promise could have, that whatever came next, they were no longer facing it alone. The horses came out of the dark like something summoned. Not something arrived, 6 riders, then 8, cresting the rise beyond the tree line with lanterns swinging and the bell still tolling overhead, pulling their mounts up hard at the edge of the field, in a line that closed off the only road out. Vane's grip on Roz's arm went rigid. This is it, she thought, heart hammering so loud she was certain he could feel it through her arm. Whatever happens in the next 60 seconds decides everything. Which way this goes. Whether Wren goes home tonight, or whether I spend the rest of my life wishing I'd done something differently right now. Nobody move, he shouted, and his men scattered into position around the chapel. Weapons up, the practiced calm of the businessman completely gone, now replaced by something rawer and more dangerous. This is private property. State your business. A woman's voice answered from the dark level and unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who had said those exact words 100 times before and never once needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. My business, the voice said, is you, Mr. Vane. The lead rider walked her horse forward into the lantern light, and Roz found herself looking at a woman close to 60, silver-streaked hair, pulled back tight, a marshal's badge catching the light at her collar, flanked on either side by riders who moved with the same unhurried certainty she did. Marshal Adelaide. Cross, the woman said, dismounting in one smooth motion, eyes moving over the scene with the quick, complete assessment of someone who missed nothing. Territorial service, 22 years. Currently on contract as private security for the Marsh estate. Her gaze settled on Roz. Mrs. Hale, I apologize for the delay. We came as fast as the bell allowed. Roz stared at her. You knew about the bell, about all of this. Elias hired me 15 years ago, Adelaide said, along with 11 other women he trusted. More than he trusted most men in this territory. We've been listening for that bell every single night since. I'll admit I was beginning to think we'd never hear it. Vane's men, Roz noticed, had gone very still. Weapons still raised, but no longer certain where to point them, outnumbered now and beginning to understand it. This doesn't concern you, Vane said, though the confidence in his voice had thinned considerably. This is a private business matter between myself and the property owner. Kidnapping at gunpoint isn't a business matter, Mr. Vane. Adelaide's voice hadn't changed pitch at all. Hadn't raised even slightly, and somehow that made it more frightening than shouting would have. It's a felony. Several actually, once we finish counting. I'd suggest you and your men lower your weapons before this becomes considerably worse for everyone involved. One of Vane's men shifted his weight, glanced sideways at his companions, the kind of glance that meant he was already doing the math. Vane clearly hadn't finished yet, 8 riders against 6 men, and the 8 showed no sign whatsoever of nervousness. Boss, the man said quietly, this isn't worth dying over. Nobody's dying over anything, Vane snapped, though the certainty in his voice had thinned to almost nothing. Hold your position. For one long suspended second, nobody moved. Roz felt Wren's hand find hers again in the dark, gripping tight, both of them holding their breath in the space between one heartbeat and the next, waiting to see which way the night was going to break. Then one of Vane's men, younger than the rest, visibly shaking, let his rifle drop. It was enough. The rest followed within seconds, weapons clattering onto wet grass, hands rising, and Adelaide's riders moved in with the calm efficiency of people who'd done this before, restraining Vane's men one by one, while Vane himself stood frozen, staring at Adelaide Cross, like he was only now understanding exactly how thoroughly he had underestimated an old man's patience. You, Vane said finally, a voice tight with something between fury and disbelief. 12 women. He actually built a private army out of 12 women. He built a network of people who kept their word. Adelaide said, stepping close enough that Vane had to look up slightly to meet her eyes. Which is apparently more than your employer thought to arrange for you. Before they led him away, Roz walked over to where Vane stood, Hands bound, all the practiced charm finally stripped from his face, and nothing left underneath it but naked resentment. You had $60,000 ready to offer me for land you knew was worth 100 times that, she said quietly. You must have thought I was very stupid or very desperate. Which was it? Does it matter now? Vane's voice had lost its polish entirely. It matters to me. Roz held his gaze steady, unflinching, the same steadiness that had gotten a foal turned right in a thunderstorm 2 nights ago now, aimed squarely at the man who'd threatened to make her daughter disappear. I want you to remember wherever they send you that you lost to a widow and a 16-year-old girl. Not to an army, not to luck. You lost because you assumed we'd be too afraid or too tired to fight back. Vane said nothing. There was nothing left in him to say, and they both knew it. They cuffed Vane's hands behind his back with rope from his own truck, and Roz found a certain bitter satisfaction in watching him march past the very coils he'd brought for someone else's wrists. Wren stood close against her mother's side. Scout pressed against both their legs' tail, finally still for the first time all night, as though even the dog understood the danger had genuinely passed. How many others, Roz asked Adelaide once the chaos had settled into something closer to order. You said he built this network because he expected someone like Vane to come eventually. Was Vane specific to us, or? Sit, Adelaide said, not unkindly, gesturing toward the chapel steps. This is going to take a while to explain properly, and you've both had a very long night. They sat. Adelaide remained standing, arms crossed, watching her people finish securing the last of Vane's men before she finally spoke again. Marcus Vane works for an organization that's been operating across this territory, and 2 others for the better part of a decade, she said. Land acquisition, they call it, when they bother calling it anything. In practice, it's theft. They identify families who've recently inherited valuable property, usually widows, usually people without the resources to fight back quickly, and they take what they want through intimidation, fraud, or worse, when those don't work fast enough. How many families, Roz asked again, quieter this time. We don't have a full account yet. Adelaide's jaw tightened, the first crack in her otherwise unshakable calm. Territorial investigators have been building a case against Vane's employer for the better part of 2 years, working off complaints that never quite added up to enough evidence on their own. A widow in the eastern counties who lost 40 acres to a forged deed. A rancher's daughter not much older than Wren, whose family's mineral rights vanished into a paperwork error that was anything but an error. Small pieces, none of them enough on their own. What happens here tonight, an armed assault witnesses a paper trail leading straight back to his organization that's likely to be the piece that finally makes the case airtight. Vane himself will face territorial court within the month, kidnapping, armed trespass, conspiracy charges that will likely keep him well occupied for the better part of the next several decades, assuming the case proceeds the way I expect it to. So there are others out there right now, Wren said slowly. Other families, going through exactly what we went through tonight. Possibly at this very moment, Adelaide said. Which is precisely why Elias built what he built, rather than simply protecting the 2 of you and calling it finished. Wren, who'd been quiet through most of this, finally spoke again, voice steadier now than it had been all night. So Uncle Elias didn't just protect us. He set up something that's going to stop this from happening to other people too. Adelaide's expression softened just slightly, the first real warmth Roz had seen cross her face all night. Your uncle, she said, understood something. Most people spend their whole lives never learning. That protecting the people you love and protecting strangers you'll never meet aren't actually 2 different things. He built one system to do both. The territorial wagon came for Vane and his men just after dawn, the sky behind the chapel gone the particular soft gray gold of morning after a long night, birds beginning their first cautious calls from the tree line, as though testing whether it was truly safe to sing yet. Roz watched the wagon pull away down the long dirt road, Vane's silhouette rigid and furious in the back of it, and felt something in her chest finally slowly begin to unclench. It's over, Wren said, not quite a question. That part, as Roz said. I think there's more to understand yet. They sat together on the chapel steps a while, not talking, just breathing in the particular quiet that follows real danger. Once it's finally past, the strange, almost disorienting calm of a body that spent all night braced for the worst, finally being told slowly that it could stop. Scout laid his head across Wren's lap and sighed the long, satisfied sigh of a dog whose whole world had just been confirmed safe again. I keep thinking about the ropes, Wren said, eventually, voice small. What they were actually for. I can't stop thinking about it. I know. Were we really going to? She couldn't finish the sentence. I don't know for certain, Roz said honestly, because lying to her daughter about this particular thing felt like exactly the wrong kind of protection. But I think we came a great deal closer to something terrible than either of us wants to sit with right now. And I think it's all right that you're scared. I'm scared too. I just also happen to be the adult, so I have to do the scared part quietly. Wren laughed wet and unsteady and leaned into her mother's shoulder. You're not that quiet about it, for the record. No, Roz admitted. I suppose I'm not. Because there was still the second seam in the vault floor, the one beneath the coin chest, the one none of them had opened. Because Elias's journal had mentioned it obliquely in an entry near the very back she hadn't fully understood before Vane's trucks arrived. Because a man who built a chapel this careful, this deliberate, did not leave anything unfinished by accident. Adelaide walked with them back down into the underground chamber, ducking her head under the low stone archway, and stood quietly at the base of the stairs, while Roz knelt beside the second seam and studied it in the clearer light of morning, filtering down through the open panel above. There's no combination lock on this one, Wren said, running her fingers along the stone. No discs, no dial. Then how? Adelaide crouched beside them, studying the seam with the practiced eye of someone who'd apparently seen more of Elias Marsh's careful engineering than either of them had. May I? Roz nodded. Adelaide reached into her jacket and produced a small brass token worn smooth with handling, stamped with the same vine pattern that ran through every carving on the property. He gave one of these to each of us. 12 women, 12 tokens. Told us that someday if the bell ever rang, whoever answered it should bring theirs. She fit the token into a small recessed groove Roz hadn't even noticed, and the stone shifted beneath their hands, with a low grinding sigh, sliding open to reveal one final chamber beneath the first. He thought of everything, Wren whispered. He had a great deal of time to think, Adelaide said, and very little else to spend it on. The final chamber was smaller than the first, and different in character entirely. No coins here, no wooden boxes stacked floor to ceiling. Just a single stone table, and on it a leather portfolio tied closed with a length of ribbon gone brittle with age, and beside that, a framed photograph Roz hadn't expected to see her mother, older than the one in the letter, standing beside a much younger Elias, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, the half-built chapel rising behind them in the background. Roz stood there a long moment before she could bring herself to touch anything. Because this room felt different from the others. Not a vault built to hide wealth, but something closer to a chapel within the chapel. A small, quiet space Elias had clearly meant for exactly one purpose and one visitor. They were happy once, Roz said quietly, picking up the frame with careful hands. Before whatever happened, they were actually happy. Read the portfolio, Adelaide said gently. I think it explains more than I can. Roz untied the ribbon with fingers that weren't entirely steady and opened it to find not more coins, not more ledgers of trade contacts, but a legal document, carefully drafted, properly witnessed, dated only 4 months before Elias's death. Last Testament and Charter of the Marsh Provision. The header read, and beneath it, in Elias's careful hand, a letter Roz understood immediately was meant to be the very last thing he'd ever say to her. Roz, if you are reading this, then you have found everything else, and Adelaide or one of her sisters has brought you here, which means the network held, which means I did not fail you the way I failed your mother. I want to tell you why I built all of this, though. I suspect by now you have guessed most of it. When Vivian and I were young, our own father lost everything he had to men, very much like the ones who likely threatened you tonight. A fraudulent land deal, a widow's inheritance stolen out from under her by men who understood the law better than grief allows anyone to. Our mother spent the rest of her life poor and afraid, and it broke something in both your mother and me that never fully healed. Vivian chose to run from it. She built a new life far from here, changed her name in every way that mattered except the legal one, and tried to protect you by making sure you never knew any of it existed. I understood her reasons, even when I disagreed with them. I chose differently. I stayed and I built something instead. First the chapel, because I needed somewhere to put my grief that wasn't just silence, and then slowly over many years, everything beneath it. Not just money, though. Money was easier to gather than I expected. What I truly built was a promise that no woman who came to me for help would ever again stand where our mother stood alone, unprotected and cheated out of everything she had by men who assumed no one would come looking. The Marsh provision is that promise made permanent. A portion of the collection, not all of it, you should keep enough to live well and worry less than you have. These past 3 years is designated as a standing fund to be administered by you and by Adelaide's network for any woman in this territory who finds herself facing what our mother faced: land theft, fraudulent inheritance, men who believe a woman alone is a woman who cannot fight back. You will find once you begin that there are more of them than you expect. There always are. But you will also find, as I did, that 12 trustworthy hands can accomplish more than $100 million sitting idle in the dark ever could alone. I never had children of my own, Roz. I told myself for years that this was simply how my life had turned out, nothing more. But watching you from a distance, watching you marry a good man, raise a daughter with your mother's stubborn kindness, in her hold a failing farm together with nothing but your own two hands, I came to understand that I had, in my own strange and silent way, spent 30 years being your uncle after all. I only wish I had found the courage to say so while I still could. Take care of Wren. Take care of the 12. And if it isn't too much to ask of a woman who has already given so much just surviving, take care of the ones who come after, the way I wished every single day that someone had taken care of us. With more love than I ever learned how to say aloud, Elias. Rose didn't realize she was crying until Wren's arms came around her. Both of them sitting on the cold stone floor of a chamber built by a man neither of them had ever met, holding on to each other while morning light finally found its way down through the open panel above. Mom! Wren's voice was thick. He wasn't just protecting us. He built something that's going to protect strangers too. For years. Maybe forever if we keep it going. I know. Are we going to keep it going? Roz looked down at the letter again, at her uncle's careful, failing handwriting. At 4 decades of grief turned patiently into something useful instead of something bitter. She thought of her mother choosing silence. She thought of Elias choosing to build instead. 2 very different answers to the exact same wound, and here she was holding both of them at once, having to decide which inheritance she was actually going to carry forward. Mom ran, she thought, and I understand why. I understand it more than I did yesterday. But running only protects the person running. It doesn't stop the next family from standing exactly where we stood tonight. Yes, she said finally, and the word came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. Yes, we're keeping it going. She looked up at Adelaide, who stood quietly at the edge of the chamber, giving them space, but clearly waiting for an answer of her own. What would that even look like? Roz asked her. Practically. I'm a farmer, I don't know the first thing about running something like this. You know more than you think, Adelaide said. You spent 3 years holding a failing farm together alone against every reasonable expectation that you'd fail. You spent one very long night refusing to be intimidated by an armed man twice your size. And you've spent your whole life, from what Elias told me, refusing to let hard things be the reason you stopped trying. She crouched down to their level voice, gentling further. The 12 of us already know how to find the women who need this. What we've never had is someone who could stand at the center of it and make the decisions Elias used to make. Someone the rest of us could trust the way we trusted him. You barely know me. I know enough, Adelaide said. I watched you refuse to hand your daughter over to an armed man tonight, even when it would have been easier and safer to comply. That tells me most of what I need to know about how you make decisions when it matters. She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, something in her voice had changed, gone softer, further away, like she was reaching back through years she didn't often talk about. I lost my own husband young too, Mrs. Hale. Before I ever took up the badge. A man came to our ranch with papers that looked legal enough, and I didn't have the money or the knowledge to fight them. And by the time I understood what had happened, half of what my husband built was already gone. Elias found me 2 years after that, working as little more than a hired hand on land that used to be mine. He didn't offer me charity. He offered me a job and a purpose, and 15 years later, I've never once regretted taking it. She met Roz's eyes steadily. I'd like to offer you the same thing he offered me. Not because you need saving, because you've already proven you don't. Because the work is better with the right people doing it, and I think you're one of them. They spent the rest of that morning above ground in the chapel itself, the stained glass throwing patches of color across the swept stone floor as the sun climbed higher outside. Adelaide's people had already begun the work of properly documenting everything. The coins, the ledger, the second chamber, all of it photographed and cataloged with the careful precision of people who understood exactly how much scrutiny this discovery was likely to receive once word of Vane's arrest reached his employer. One of Adelaide's men, a quiet, methodical fellow named Thomas, who'd said barely a dozen words all night, worked his way carefully through the wooden boxes on the shelves, cross-referencing each one against Elias's inventory with the patience of a man who understood that sloppy documentation now meant a weaker case later. "Your uncle kept better records than most banks I've audited," he said at one point, not looking up from his work. "Every acquisition dated, sourced, and priced fair. This is going to make the legal transfer considerably simpler than these things usually are." "There will be more men," Adelaide said, watching her people work. "Once the organization understands Vane failed and understands why, you should expect at least some further interest in this property before everything is fully resolved." "Let them come," Roz said, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she meant it entirely. "They'll find considerably more resistance than they're expecting." Wren, sitting on the chapel steps with a torn ledger page still folded in her jacket pocket, looked up at that. "You kept that whole time, didn't you? You knew we'd need it eventually." "I kept a lot of things," Roz said, sitting beside her daughter, watching the light move slowly across the field, where only hours before armed men had stood ready to make both of them disappear. "Some of them I didn't even know I was keeping until I needed them." 3 months later, the story had settled into something closer to routine, though routine looked entirely different now than it had before the letter arrived. The banknote was paid in full, the roof repaired, and Delphine's full of Philly. Wren had named Marsh over Roz's mild objection that naming a horse after an entire branch of the family felt excessive, had grown steady enough on her legs to run the length of the near pasture without stumbling. But the farm was no longer simply a farm. In the front room, where a three-legged chair had once sat as the only furniture there was, now a proper desk, and on it the Marsh Provisions growing files. Women's names, women's stories, each one a small variation on the same old cruelty their grandmother had suffered a lifetime ago. A rancher's widow in the next county cheated out of grazing rights by a nephew who'd forged her late husband's signature. A jeweler 2 territories over nearly swindled out of her shop by men claiming false debts. Case by case, the 12 women, 13 now with Roz among them, worked to make certain none of them ended up as alone as Elias once had. Wren had changed too, in ways Roz found herself noticing at odd moments, folding laundry, mucking stalls, watching her daughter across the supper table. The girl who'd once bolted headlong toward a strange oak tree without a second thought for her own safety had grown into something steadier without losing any of that same fearless curiosity, as though the danger they'd survived together had refined rather than diminished her. She still moved through the world like everything in it was a puzzle worth solving. She'd simply learned the hard way that some puzzles came with real stakes attached. Even Scout seemed to understand something had shifted. He no longer bolted for the tree line the way he once had, chasing scent, without a thought for what waited at the end of it. Now he circled the property each evening with a kind of proprietary calm, as if he too had taken on some small share of the family's new responsibilities, and considered guarding the chapel and its long dirt road simply another chore alongside the stalls and the pasture fence. "You're quieter than you used to be," Roz told her one evening, the two of them shelling peas on the porch while Scout dozed at their feet. "Not sad quiet, just thinking quiet more than you used to be." "I think about that night a lot," Wren admitted. "Not the scary parts, mostly. The part where you set the last dial to Grandma's death date. I keep thinking about how hard that must have been, and how you didn't even hesitate once you understood why it mattered." "I hesitated plenty. You just didn't see it." "Maybe." Wren considered this, shelling another pod with more care than the task strictly required. "I think I understand Uncle Elias a little better now, too. Why he built something instead of just grieving quietly the way Grandma did. Building things is easier than sitting still with the sad parts, I think." That, Roz said, might be the truest thing either of us has said all week. She meant it. There was a comfort in it, too. The plain fact that grief could be built into something instead of only endured, that a man could take the worst thing that ever happened to his family and turn it slowly, patiently over 40 quiet years into a door standing open for anyone who needed to walk through it. Adelaide Cross became a regular presence on the property, arriving every few weeks with updates, sometimes with new cases, sometimes simply to sit on the porch and talk in the particular unhurried way of someone who had finally, after 15 years, found the person she'd been waiting to hand her patience over to. "You're good at this," Adelaide told her one evening watching Wren muck stalls in the last of the daylight while Scout supervised from his favorite spot by the barn door. "Better than Elias, if I'm honest. He built the promise. You're the one making it live." "I had good teachers," Roz said, "even the ones I never got to meet." Wren, it turned out, had inherited more from her great-uncle than either of them expected. She'd taken to spending her evenings in the front room now, to poring over case files with the same methodical patience she'd once used to search every loose floorboard in a ruined house. And more than once, Roz caught her daughter drafting careful notes in a hand that had started unmistakably to slant the same careful way Elias's had. "You're doing the thing," Roz told her one night, nodding at the notebook. "The handwriting thing." Wren looked down at the page, surprised. "I didn't even notice." "He's in you, whether you noticed or not," Roz said. "Same as your grandmother is, same as your father is, honestly, in the way you refuse to leave a job half-finished." She reached over and squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Some people leave money behind. Yours left you patience and stubbornness in equal measure. I think that's the better inheritance, if I'm honest." 2 weeks earlier, they had made the half-day's ride together to Deer Creek Wren, insisting on coming along, both of them arriving at a small jewelry shop with a bell above the door that rang disarmingly, almost exactly like the one Roz now heard in her dreams some nights. Margaret Foss had turned out to be a stout, sharp-eyed woman near 70 hands, still steady enough to set stones despite the arthritis she mentioned only once and never complained about again. "Elias wrote to me the week after my husband died," Margaret had told them, setting out tea with hands that clearly did most things without needing to be asked. "Told me exactly what a man named Halloran was about to try before Halloran had so much as knocked on my door. I thought he was a fortune teller. Turned out he was simply paying very close attention to men who preyed on women like me." "Did the plan work?" Wren had asked. "Whatever Halloran was trying, not for one single day," Margaret said, "and there had been real satisfaction in it, 40 years old, and still sharp as the day it happened. I had the paperwork ready before he even arrived. Elias is doing every bit of it." She'd looked at Roz, then something searching in her expression. "You have his eyes, you know, not the color. The way you're watching me right now, like you're deciding whether I'm telling the whole truth or just the convenient parts." "Am I?" Roz had asked, and Margaret had laughed, delighted, and told her that yes, precisely, that was exactly the family trait she meant. The drive home that evening, Wren had been quiet a long while before finally saying what was clearly sitting heavy in her chest. "I want to help, not just watch you do it. I want to actually be part of this when I'm old enough." "You're already part of it," Roz had told her, eyes on the darkening road ahead. "You tore a page out of a ledger under an armed man's nose without your hands shaking once. I think you've been part of this since roughly the moment you found that loose floorboard." That night, after Adelaide had ridden off down the long dirt road and Wren had gone up to bed, Roz sat alone at the desk in the front room, the last of the day's files closed in front of her, and found herself looking, as she often did lately, at the framed photograph she'd taken from the deepest chamber beneath the chapel. Her mother and her uncle, young and laughing, a half-built promise rising behind them that neither of them could have known would take 40 more years and one very long night to finally be finished. "We kept it going," she said quietly to no one, to both of them. "Whatever you two are trying to build, we're keeping it going." Outside, past the dark field, past the tree line, the chapel stood exactly where it always had, no longer a secret, no longer a mystery, but something entirely different now. A promise finished at last, standing quiet and pale under the stars, waiting for whoever needed it next. And somewhere in that quiet, if you listened closely enough, you could almost believe you heard the faint, distant echo of a bell that had already done everything it was ever built to do, and would, if it ever needed to, again do it once more without hesitation. Roz closed the last file, blew out the lamp, and went up to check on her daughter before she finally, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself a full night's sleep.